My husband was away on a business trip when my selfish mother-in-law and sister-in-law stormed into our home with lawyers in tow. "Your husband is dead," they declared coldly. "He died in a car accident, and before he passed, he transferred this house to us. Now, get out." I was paralyzed with shock, confusion swirling in my mind as I reached for my phone to call David, only to find it switched off. The lawyers coldly ordered me to pack my things, and just as despair began to settle in, a figure appeared at the doorstep, changing everything in an instant. That moment would alter the course of my life forever. My name is Emma, and this is the story of how my life took unexpected turns, testing my strength and resolve. I'm 36 years old, and for the past 8 years, I've been married to David, the man I believed was my rock. We live in a charming old house in Seattle, one I inherited from my parents. It's filled with memories and the warmth of my childhood, but recently, it has become a battleground for family dynamics I never anticipated. David is a wonderful man, compassionate and caring. He's always supported me emotionally through our struggles to have a child. We longed to start a family, but fate had other plans. I've faced multiple heartbreaking miscarriages, each one leaving me feeling more hollow than the last. It's hard to explain the pain of carrying a child and losing it, the dreams we build only to see them shatter. Every time I had to share the news of another loss with David, I felt like I was chipping away at the foundation of our love. Despite the emotional turmoil, David has always stood by me. He's the kind of person who puts his family's needs above his own, often sacrificing his own happiness to ensure others are cared for. His heart is big, but I often feel like I'm competing with his family for his attention. His mother, Mrs. Walters, and his sister, Sarah, seem to view me as an outsider. Their disdain grows stronger with every passing year that I fail to give David the children they believe he deserves. Sarah, especially, is a piece of work. She's 35, recently divorced, and has been living with our mother-in-law since her marriage fell apart. She relies heavily on David for financial support, and with every favor he grants her, I feel a piece of our life together slip away. Ethan, Sarah's 9-year-old son, often becomes the pawn in their games, dropped off at our house unannounced. I never signed up to be a babysitter, yet I find myself in that role more often than I'd like to admit. One particularly exhausting day, I found Ethan sprawled on our living room floor, toys scattered everywhere, while I tried to work on an interior design project. I glanced at my watch, wondering when Sarah would come to collect him. I could feel the tension building inside me. Just then, Sarah walked in without knocking, her eyes scanning the room. "Emma, can you make sure Ethan does his homework?" she said casually, plopping herself on the couch. "I have errands to run." "Of course, Sarah," I replied, forcing a smile, even though frustration bubbled inside me. "But I also have deadlines to meet today." She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you can manage. What else do you have to do around here, anyway?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice even. "Actually, I have quite a bit on my plate." As she left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being treated like a free maid rather than a member of the family. I tried to help Ethan with his homework, but my mind kept drifting to the condescending comments Sarah had thrown my way. David was often oblivious to the tension in our home. He worked long hours, trying to provide for his family, while supporting me emotionally. One evening, after a long day, he finally opened up about his plans. "I've invested $150,000 into a new tech project," he announced, excitement bubbling in his voice. "I really think it's going to pay off, but I'll need to cut back on helping my family for a while." My heart sank at his words. Mrs. Walters and Sarah had always relied on him financially, and I could already envision the fallout. When David shared the news, I noticed a shadow cross Mrs. Walters' face, and Sarah dropped her fork mid-bite. "What do you mean, cut back?" Mrs. Walters demanded, her voice dripping with disapproval. "We depend on you, David." "I know, but Emma and I need to plan for our future, too," he replied, his voice steady but gentle. Once David left for work the next morning, Mrs. Walters pulled me aside. "You do realize, dear, that if you can't give David a child, he might rethink this whole arrangement," she whispered, her words dripping with venom. I felt a lump in my throat but managed to respond. David and I are in this together. We'll figure it out. As they drove away, I stood in the doorway, watching them go, feeling the weight of their expectations crushing me. My home, once a sanctuary filled with love, had transformed into a place where betrayal and resentment lurked in the corners. Days turned into weeks, and the tension at home continued to grow. Sarah and Mrs. Walters became more demanding, and their subtle digs at my inability to conceive cut deeper than any knife. I felt like a ghost in my own life, haunted by their unspoken judgments. One afternoon, as I brewed coffee, I found myself staring out the window, lost in thought. My phone buzzed, breaking my reverie. It was a message from David saying he had to go on a business trip for a few days. While he was away, I hoped to find a moment of peace to collect my thoughts. But peace was a luxury I could not afford. That very night, as I sat in silence, I felt the world around me closing in. Little did I know that the true storm was yet to come, and it would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage and the people I trusted most. Little did I know, while David was away, Sarah and Mrs. Walters were concocting a plan that would turn my life upside down. As the days passed, I felt the weight of impending betrayal, and it loomed over me like a dark cloud, ready to burst. David was away on his business trip for 3 days, and each day felt like an eternity. I tried to occupy myself with work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah and Mrs. Walters. The atmosphere in the house felt heavy, as if the walls were closing in on me. I knew they were up to something. I could feel it in my bones. On the second day, just as I was finishing up a project, I received an unexpected visitor. Sarah knocked on the door, her face painted with a sly smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Emma, I thought I'd drop by to see how you're doing. You know, it must be lonely here without David," she said, her tone sugary sweet. "Yeah, it's quiet," I replied cautiously, trying to gauge her intentions. "Mind if I come in? I have a few things I want to discuss," she said, stepping inside before I could respond. I gestured for her to take a seat, but she opted to lean against the counter, her posture relaxed yet calculating. "You know, Emma, I've been thinking a lot about family lately. It's so important to have strong connections, especially when it comes to property and inheritance," she said, her eyes narrowing. I felt my stomach twist. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, nothing really. Just that sometimes you have to ensure that everything is in order, especially for the future. You know how it is, making sure everything goes to the right people," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Her words hung in the air like a thick fog. I wanted to push her for more details, but I also feared what I might uncover. "Look, Sarah, I appreciate your concern, but David and I have everything under control." She shrugged, a fake smile plastered across her face. Of course. Just thought I'd offer some advice." The conversation felt like a trap, and as she left, I was left feeling uneasy. I tried to shake it off, but the nagging feeling in my gut refused to go away. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the sense of impending doom. The next morning, I awoke to find a message from David asking how things were going at home. I replied, trying to keep things light, but I couldn't help but mention the strange visit from Sarah. I waited anxiously for his response, but it didn't come immediately. As the day wore on, I received another unexpected visit, this time from Mrs. Walters. "Emma, dear, I hope you're doing well," she said, walking into my house without waiting for an invitation. "Of course, Mrs. Walters. What brings you here?" I asked, my voice tight. "I just wanted to check on you. You know how it is. David's not here, and I thought you might need some company," she said, her eyes scanning the room as if evaluating everything I owned. "Thanks, but I'm fine. Just keeping busy with work," I replied, trying to keep the conversation short. She didn't take the hint. Instead, she launched into a lecture about family values, loyalty, and the importance of sticking together, especially during tough times. Her words felt insidious, as if she were trying to plant seeds of doubt in my mind. "You know, dear," she said, her tone shifting slightly, "family is everything. It's crucial to ensure that the right people inherit what belongs to them." I felt a cold chill run down my spine.
What do you mean by that?
I asked, forcing myself to remain calm. Oh, nothing at all. Just a little advice, she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. You can never be too careful. I nodded, dismissing her words as mere manipulation. I knew what she was trying to do. She wanted to rattle me. But I had no idea how deep their plans truly ran. Days passed, and with each passing hour, the tension continued to build. David returned home late on the fourth day, exhausted but relieved to be back. How did everything go? He asked, wrapping his arms around me. It was fine, but there were a couple of strange visits from Sarah and your mother, I confessed, trying to keep my tone light. Strange how, he pressed, concern etched on his face. They seemed unusually interested in our future and what it means for family, I said, watching his expression change. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. They can be overbearing sometimes, but don't worry about them. We're building our life together, and that's what matters. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Just when I thought I could breathe a sigh of relief, the front door swung open, and I was greeted by an unexpected sight. Sarah and Mrs. Walters standing there with a group of lawyers, their expressions filled with determination. Emma, Sarah said, her voice cold and calculated. We need to talk. Before I could respond, the lawyers began unfolding documents, their intentions clear as day. My heart raced as I realized that this was the moment I had feared. The storm was finally here, and I was unprepared for the chaos that was about to unfold. David, what's happening? I asked, my voice trembling. Just stay calm, Emma, David said, his face a mask of shock. I knew in that moment that everything was about to change, and the weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air. The confrontation was only beginning, and the truth would soon unravel in ways I never imagined. The tension in the room was palpable as Sarah and Mrs. Walters stood at the threshold, flanked by a group of lawyers, all holding folders filled with documents. My heart raced as I turned to David, who looked equally bewildered. Emma, Sarah began, her tone dripping with false sweetness, we need to discuss some very important matters regarding the house. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The lawyer stepped forward, clearing his throat. Mrs. Walters and Ms. Walters are here to present legal documents concerning the ownership of this property. We have reason to believe that it was transferred to Mrs. Walters by David before his untimely death. What? I gasped, unable to process what was happening. David is not dead. David's face turned pale. This is absurd. I'm right here. Ignoring his protest, the lawyer continued. The documents claim that since you, Emma, have been unable to bear children, David wanted to ensure that the property remained within the family. Therefore, he signed over the ownership to his mother. I felt the ground beneath me shift. David would never do that, I exclaimed, turning to him, desperation creeping into my voice. Is this true? David shook his head vehemently.
No, Emma.
I would never sign anything without discussing it with you first. This has to be a mistake. Mrs. Walters stepped forward, her expression feigning sympathy. Oh, Emma, it's just business. You know how it is. Family must come first. We have to think of the future. Family? I cried out, my voice rising. You've always treated me like an outsider. You never cared about us until now. Enough, Sarah snapped. This is not about your feelings. It's about what's rightfully ours. You need to step aside. My world felt like it was crashing down around me. I couldn't believe this was happening. I had always feared that their disdain for me would lead to something like this, but I never thought they would go this far. The lawyers began to sift through the documents, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, David stepped forward, his voice firm and resolute. You both think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine? You've underestimated me, and you've underestimated Emma. The tension in the room crackled as he pulled out his phone, quickly scrolling through his messages. I have proof. I've been recording conversations since I suspected something was off with you two. What are you talking about? Sarah asked, her facade cracking. David's voice grew stronger as he said, I know about the plans you made while I was gone. I know you were plotting to take this house and my assets." Mrs. Walters's face flushed with anger, and she stepped closer to David. "You have no right to speak to your mother that way. You're being dramatic." "Dramatic," he replied, incredulous. "You and Sarah are the ones who've plotted behind my back. I'm not going to let you manipulate me any longer." As he revealed the recordings, I listened, heart pounding, as their voices echoed in the room. I felt sick as I heard them conspiring about how to take advantage of my inability to have children, how they could convince me that David didn't want me anymore. "No," I gasped, tears welling in my eyes. I felt a mix of betrayal and anger toward both David's mother and sister. With every recorded conversation played, Mrs. Walters and Sarah's faces grew pale, and the smug confidence they had entered with began to fade. "This isn't over, David," Sarah hissed, her voice low and threatening. "You'll regret this." But before I could respond, David had already dialed the police. "I want to press charges for fraud and conspiracy," he said firmly, his voice steady. As the sirens approached, Mrs. Walters turned to me with a desperate look in her eyes. "Emma, please. Don't let this happen. Your family. We can work this out." "Family?" I shot back, feeling empowered. "You've never treated me like family. You wanted to take everything from me." "I'm not backing down." The doorbell rang, and in rushed the police officers. "We received a report of a disturbance." "What's going on here?" one officer asked, surveying the tense scene. David stepped forward, pointing at Mrs. Walters and Sarah. "They've been trying to fraudulently take my property and assets. They've conspired against me and my wife." The officers quickly assessed the situation, and as they began to gather information, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The truth was coming to light, and for the first time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. As the officers began to handcuff Sarah and Mrs. Walters, their faces twisted in shock and anger, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The battle was far from over, but I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. With David by my side, I realized I was ready to fight back. This was no longer just about a house. It was about our future, our love, and the truth that would set us free. As the police officers led Sarah and Mrs. Walters away, I felt a mix of emotions swirling inside me: relief, anger, and a sense of newfound strength. David stood beside me, his expression a mixture of determination and concern. "Are you okay, Emma?" he asked softly, his hand resting on my shoulder. "I will be," I replied, taking a deep breath. "I just can't believe how far they went to try and take everything from us." David nodded, his jaw set in resolve. "We'll get through this together. You and I against the world, remember?" The police finished taking statements and assured us they would investigate the matter further. As the door closed behind the officers, a silence fell over the house, one that felt different from before. It was no longer filled with tension and deceit, but with a strange sense of clarity. "Can you believe this happened?" I said, shaking my head in disbelief. "They plotted against us while you were away. It's like I was living in a nightmare." David took my hands in his, looking into my eyes. "Emma, we're done living in fear. This is our home, and no one has the right to take that away from us. We'll make it through this." With the burden of their betrayal finally lifted, we decided it was time to heal. David suggested we take a trip, just the two of us, to reconnect and remind ourselves why we fell in love in the first place. "Let's get away from all this for a bit," he said, his eyes sparkling with hope. "I want to show you how much you mean to me." The very next weekend, we packed our bags and headed to a cozy cabin in the mountains. The scenery was breathtaking, and as we settled in, I felt a wave of peace wash over me. We spent our days hiking, exploring, and talking about everything: our dreams, our future, and how we wanted to build a family together. One night, while sitting by the fire, David took a deep breath. "Emma, I know we've been through so much, but I want you to know that you are my priority. We'll find a way to have the family we both want, whether that's through adoption or naturally. We're in this together." Tears filled my eyes as I leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his love envelop me. "I can't wait for our future, David." I finally feel like we can build something without their shadows looming over us. After our trip, we returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. We decided to start the process of adoption, something we had always talked about but never pursued. It felt like the right step forward, a way to fill our home with love and laughter, regardless of the circumstances we faced. As we settled into this new chapter, I found joy in small things, decorating the house with colors that brought me peace, planning our future, and even the thought of welcoming a child into our lives filled me with excitement. The memory of Sarah and Mrs. Walters faded, replaced by the hope of what was to come. Our life was no longer clouded by betrayal or deceit. Instead, it was brightened by the possibilities that lay ahead. David and I were stronger than ever, ready to embrace our new beginning and all the adventures it would bring. In the end, I realized that sometimes you have to fight for what you love. The experience had changed me, but it also showed me the strength of our bond. As we closed the door on the past, I knew we were ready to face whatever the future held, hand in hand, hearts united, and filled with love.